Welcome to the Seed Family Podcast,
where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 48, and today I'm here with Blake Boles talking about teens. Blake is a writer, speaker, and adventurer. He's the founder of Unschool Adventures and the author of Why Are You Still Sending Your Kids to School? The Art of Self-Directed Learning, Better Than College, and College Without High School. He also hosts the Off Trail Learning podcast and delivers presentations at conferences and schools around the world. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. We have another contribution to our 5-star rating from 4 Amazing Souls, who writes, Game changer. I love Rachel's wit, humor, openness, and honesty. She brings a kindness and wisdom to all of her conversations. My mind is continuously opened by Rachel's smart and thoughtful way she navigates so many amazing topics. This podcast helps me feel grounded, mindful, and makes me into a better version of myself. Thanks, Mama. Thank you, 4 Amazing Souls, for leaving such a lovely review. And you too can leave a review on iTunes that I might read right here on the podcast. This adventure of the week was yet another wonderful family bike ride at an awesome new trail through farmland and historic bridges. But the piece I want to focus on this week is that we were riding with friends. I know a lot of you are considering how you want to wade back into socialization. So I thought I would share what we're doing on this front. We have formed what I affectionately refer to as a pod, which is a very small group of families who share our level of hygienic or exposure diligence, with whom we get together for outdoor play and adventures. On these escapades, our children play together freely, while the adults thoughtfully manage some of the conditions and keep a reasonable distance from each other. In other words, the parents don't bring big bowls of fruit for everyone to share, and we don't hug each other upon arrival, those kinds of precautions. So we're limiting our network of exposure. All the families are on the same page, and our kids get to play with friends. This feels good for us. I'm not suggesting that this should be the exact configuration that your family adopts. This is not medical advice I am offering here. But I'm hoping it will inspire some creativity around what reconnecting could look like for your family whenever you do feel ready to start reconnecting. I'm adding a new segment to the podcast called Our Little Obsession, where I share something that we're digging. It could be a product that is solving a problem for us, or a movie that we're obsessed with, or a person or program that's rocking our world. Something that's adding value for us that I think might add value for you too. Last week, I told you about the Greenlight Kids debit card program that we were excited to try, and I told you I would follow up next time and let you know how it went. Well, the kids got their debit cards in the mail, and it really is working as well as we had hoped. They each have an app on their device that's like online banking, where they can see and manage their own money, set up savings rates and goals, and earn an allowance to practice all these juicy money management skills. You all know that personal finance is a passion of mine because it really is a key to accessing the life of my dreams. And on the homeschooling front, I'm so excited to have this tool that makes these lessons experiential for my kids. It's one thing to give our kids a seat at the table of our family economy, which I do recommend, but it takes it to a whole other level when you put the debit cards in their hands. If they choose a 50% savings rate and they have a 2% interest rate on that savings, they see their money growing. These are hard concepts to grasp in the abstract, but easy to feel when the power to manage that money is fully in their hands. You can sign up for a free trial at greenlight.grsm.io/sagefamily. Sorry for the annoyingly clumsy link, but it's in the show notes too. And as an affiliate, you'll be supporting the show when you do. If you want to see photos and videos of our biking adventure or my kids with their debit cards and apps, then head on over to sage.family on Instagram and follow along. I've followed along with Blake's work for years as he's been writing and speaking about unschooling teens and launching, and his new book, Why Are You Still Sending Your Kids to School?, is my favorite of his body of work. My oldest is 14 now and is definitely growing into this new season of life. So I'm looking forward to talking about how we can help our teens thrive. Welcome, Blake. You want to share your story with us? Tell us who you are and how you are connected with this topic of unschooling teens.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. And sure, some people ask me if I was alternatively educated myself. I was not. I grew up in California public schools. I was a straight A student. I went straight into college to study something impressive sounding, and that was astrophysics. And so I could tell people and my mom and dad that I studied astrophysics at Berkeley. Wasn't that a nice pat on the back?
Yes.
It was a bit misguided, though. And as I detail in the book and in my other books, I realized that I went to college for maybe the traditionally uninformed reasons that an 18-year-old might go to college. For me, I think the biggest thing was the movie Contact in 1997.
Jodie Foster, right?
Jodie Foster.
Yep.
She's an astrophysicist. She meets Matthew McConaughey, who's this dreamy reformed priest. They have long discussions about science versus religion, and she gets a message from extraterrestrials, builds a machine, travels across the galaxy. The life of every astrophysics student, undoubtedly. So in college, I saw what actual research scientists, grad students, and professors did, and I wasn't really interested in that path. I was thinking about becoming a high school science teacher, and that's when I started reading John Taylor Gatto and Grace Llewellyn. I started learning about Sudbury schools. I read some of the reformers from the 60s and 70s, and just went down the rabbit hole into this literature of alternative education, self-directed education, and unschooling, and decided I had to study this stuff full time. So I designed my own major and graduated with the least marketable degree ever issued by UC Berkeley. But then went into the field of outdoor education, then eventually into the field of working with teenage unschoolers and other unconventional teenagers.
Oh, I love it. What a fun journey. I can totally relate. I went to college to a 4-year university because my parents made me, and proceeded to leave college at the end of freshman year. And my parents used to joke that, because I met my husband freshman year in the dorms, they used to joke that he was a very expensive purchase because that was all that I got out of that freshman year of college was meeting my husband. And it wasn't really until I got free to kind of live on my own and get to know myself better and find my place in the world that I went to community college and opened up the program and picked like the 2 classes that interested me the most. And it wasn't until I really had that experience and got to get back in touch with like learning for the sake of learning, and got connected to sort of a larger purpose with it that I really dove in head first and then was in school for a million years, but for my own sort of self-directed reasons. And it felt like a whole completely different game.
Yeah. So we had similar experiences.
And similar in the sense that I am not making the loads of money with a highly marketable degree that my parents might have hoped. Okay, yeah. So let's talk about...
Did you notice the subchapter in my book called How to Give Up $35,000 a Year?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. I totally related to it. Yeah, that was my story too. Okay, so self-directed learning. How can we best support teens in their self-directed learning?
Well, we got to break this question apart. Should we talk about teens in school or teens outside of school first, Rachel?
Teens outside of school.
Okay, great. Well, then most of the work is done already. So many parents struggle with just making that move of walking away from the conventional education system. And I think that once you've made that move, the hard part is over. But there's still a lot of confusion, and there's still a lot of questions about how you support a self-directed learner, especially regarding motivation. And when a kid seems to be doing nothing, in the sense of nothing that's considered productive by adults or by your friends, then what's your role as a parent? How much do you step in and intervene? How much do you offer resources and strew opportunities for them? How much do you just step back and let them fail and let them suffer, let them experience boredom and listlessness when they come and ask you for help? Do you immediately jump in and provide it? Or do you say, well, this sounds like something you could probably figure out yourself, and so why don't you try that first? If you're really stumped, come back to me. And of course, there's no single answer to all of these questions. It depends on who your kid is, what your relationship is with them. Some people from the democratic free school world, the Sudbury education world, they're pretty adamant about not offering any help. They say if a parent or other adult steps in even a well-intentioned and friendly way to try to say, like, hey, there's this thing happening at the museum. Do you want to check it out with me? They might consider that some form of oppression, some form of coercion, of distracting the kid from their discovery of their natural interests. I don't hold that position myself. I think that most parents can figure out a middle ground, which is not completely hands-off, you're on your own kid, figure it out, tough luck, nor is it essentially the Tiger Mom version of homeschooling, where you're like, I know what's best for you. Here's all the different opportunities you should be seizing right now. By the way, if you ever want to get into an Ivy League school, you should have learned pre-algebra 2 years ago. So chop, chop, let's go.
Yeah, I completely agree with that in that spectrum being somewhere in the middle. I try to let my kids be the drivers, and I extend invitations or expose them to things that they may not have otherwise discovered or been exposed to, sort of presenting options, but then still honoring that consent piece, that agency that they still get to have.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to change year to year or even month to month. And sometimes kids really do need to be left alone and not influenced in any way, however helpful, especially in the deschooling period. And other times they're hungry for opportunities. They want you to throw stuff out there, even if they don't make that clear. And that's, I guess, I'm not a parent yet myself, Rachel, but I imagine that to be, based on working with hundreds of other people's teenagers, the secret sauce of raising a teenager. Yes, absolutely. I have to say it's funny because when I first started homeschooling and my kids were very young, there was sort of this assumption that as they got older, like this whole unschooling thing is fine when they're little, but as they get older, surely the coercion ramps up. Like what's mandatory from you to them ramps up, and the instruction gets more didactic. And I have found really the exact opposite, in the sense that as my children get older, they, the flip side to that freedom is like responsibility and independence and competence. Like they grow into more ownership over how they have a clear sense of how they want to spend their time and what work feels purposeful to them in this moment. And so they get to sort of take even more of the reins over where they are and what they do and how they do it. Yeah, and that goes along with something I try to emphasize in the book, which is that adolescents, since time immemorial, have had actual responsibilities. They've done actual work. They've contributed to their societies. They've acted a lot more like adults. And just about 100 years ago, give or take, is when we really, first of all, outlawed child labor, which is a good thing, and also, as a consequence of that, instituted middle schools and high schools and said that this is something for everyone, not just a more privileged sliver of society. And these schools, they help keep kids off the street. For many kids, they serve as social welfare providers, and that's an important thing. And of course, some kids do have genuinely positive experiences in conventional schools, public and private. But I think for so many kids, there is this big lack of meaningful work for them. They see the assignments and the classes and the tests that are put in front of them, and they say, you're just doing this to keep me busy. Mm-hmm. They might not have the words for that, but you can sense it. You can sense that not much real stuff is going on in schools. And that also happens with conventional homeschooling when kids get into the adolescent years. For some, they're happy to follow a curriculum to, work towards college prep type goals in the same way that kids in school do. But so many others say, this just feels so artificial. I want to be doing something real. Yes. This need, this thirst for real challenge, real work. I think that is what we need to pay close attention to. And that gets into gaming and other stuff I know we're going to talk about, Rachel. So I'll stop myself right there.
No, that's perfect. Let's talk about that gaming piece. Like, what are teens getting out of gaming?
Well, if teens are looking for challenges, that means they're often looking for places where they have a sense of control. They have a sense of ownership and autonomy, agency. I can just keep rattling off these buzzwords here. And they want a place where they can get really good at something, where they can build their skills as fast as possible. I mean, most human beings enjoy that. They enjoy having the freedom to work on something that interests them and get better at that thing. That just feels great, no matter who you are. And when their other options are limited or they're very narrow in the sense of just being academic or school-like options, a lot of kids, whether or not they go to school, will gravitate towards games. And there are some really incredible games out there today. So I grew up in the 90s, and there was just the beginning of these more advanced, complex games, video games, computer games, sometimes, role-playing games or tabletop card games like Magic the Gathering. And these games were very immersive worlds. I remember playing a game called Diablo, which is one of the first massive multiplayer online role-playing games, kind of like World of Warcraft is today. And I remember it blew my mind because I would partner up with these complete strangers who were, people of any age, I don't know, with weird screen names, different parts of the world. And we would go into these underground dungeons and battle monsters and get gold points and, armor and spells, that kind of stuff, nerdy stuff. And then we'd have to battle these really big bosses. And I took this work very seriously in the same way that you might see a kid today who's really immersed in Minecraft or Fortnite or The Sims, or I'm probably already dating myself by
no, those are things my kids are into.
Okay, good. Phew. So when you see the kids really immersed in these worlds, it's often because they are doing something which is a complex task that they are doing with other people socially, and the reward for completing this task is not the end of the game. It's another more challenging task. And that is something to really pay attention to, because that is the sort of meta-learning skill that we really want to generate in young people. We want to promote taking on hard, complex tasks, loving the work. And then once you've completed the task, you're like, okay, what's next? Like, that's the kind of person who I want to work with as, a coworker. That's the kind of person I would want to hire in the future.
Yeah.
Need I say more? But gaming is such a trigger point for so many parents because it seems like the kid is not doing anything.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think you may have been quoting a different book. What's the name of that book that talks about gaming, written by a woman who worked in gaming?
Yeah, Jane McGonigal. She wrote Reality is Broken. Wonderful book.
Yes, that's it. And I think you talk about, that may have come from her, about the 4 ingredients, that they have specific goals, clear rules, useful feedback, and voluntary participation.
Exactly.
Yeah, I found that so helpful too, because sometimes when parents are sort of feeling like they're adrift in fear, it can be helpful to, I try to encourage them to start thinking about and getting curious about and being open-minded about what their teen is getting out of the gaming. And this was something that you talked about in your book that provided a little bit of structure that can sort of act like rungs on a ladder for parents to kind of get there. Like they're setting these clear, specific goals. these games have clear rules that everyone agrees to follow. You're getting useful feedback while you're playing, and their participation is voluntary. And when you have sort of all of those four ingredients, it's like the work becomes meaningful. And there's like hard fun. You talked about that piece, which I really appreciated too, that's something that, you know, the parent might look at the situation and say they're doing nothing, quote unquote. But there's this strand through it all of hard fun. Like they're being challenged while it's still playful. And then that social piece too that you brought in, I think is so important because teens especially have sort of always had these places in the real world where they could gather, where they didn't have to be there and adults weren't supervising and meddling in it. And all of those places are really going away. So video games, like the virtual world, is a place where they can still gather together and connect with each other, without adults trying to run the show.
That's right. And, you know, something that Peter Gray and Lenore Skenazy are really big on promoting is, you know, free play within local neighborhoods. And they say this is what kids did for decades and decades. And probably parents, you remember having this experience. And today we are denying kids that experience. But it's a very hard thing to combat because you can't just send your own kid out into the neighborhood and say, you know, go knock on doors. I guess you could do that, but you probably wouldn't be that successful because there's this culture of more protective parenting today. And that means just letting your kid wander around and not knowing where they are for hours has become less and less tenable. And so, yeah, that's why these kids will find these online environments. And, you know, entire social lives are built in Fortnite today. Like if your kid is not allowed to play Fortnite, there is a good chance that that is the equivalent of, you know, when you were growing up being told, no, you may not go to the mall and hang out. And so, yeah, we need to recognize the budding social needs of adolescents and try to indulge them and respect them. It's hard when, you know, it looks like gaming addiction at the same time. And it's a lot of screen time. I know that's a bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a mother reached out to me recently with her concerns that her son was spending so much time gaming. And I explained that the gaming is meeting a need for him, or you can think of it like it's a solution to a problem, and tried to encourage her to have that, like sort of embrace that posture of open-minded curiosity and it's just to better understand what that need is and how it's meeting it so she could flesh that out with additional ways to meet that need. So like, does he play online with friends? She's like, yes. And I said, does he struggle to maintain meaningful relationships with peers at school? Because this child attends school. And she wrote back in all caps, yes. Okay, so then
there's a connection here.
There we go. So instead of focusing on how to stop the gaming, like focus on how to help him with friendship. Maybe he needs more opportunities for socialization outside of school. Maybe he could use some social skills support. Maybe you guys could attend like Minecon, like the Minecraft conference, or join a D&D group at your local comic book store. My teen, right when the pandemic shut everything down, she was starting up a D&D group at our local library. So there are ways to flesh out the sort of hole that gaming is filling. Not that there's anything wrong with gaming filling it also, but if you're feeling like things are so out of balance, you can flesh out those other things as opposed to taking the approach of like, just pull the plug.
Shut it down.
Yeah, shut it down. Gaming's bad. Because then they still have this need that's now completely unmet.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Okay, connection is a core principle that I talk about in all my work. And your book goes into the connection piece in the context of teens with their peer community in a way that I think is really helpful for parents to understand. So what do teens need in terms of connection with their peer community? What are they looking for? What do they need?
Well, there's a lot of just basic social needs like we were just discussing, and that becomes much more relevant in the adolescent years. But the word connection it's a tricky word to pin down. What does it mean? How would you even define connection, Rachel, if you use it quite often in your work? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that connection, like from the time a child is born until they hit adolescence, connection particularly in the audience that I work with, it's really about connection between the parent and the child. And so we talk a lot about and put so much energy into building this trusting relationship where the people have a sense of belonging and they support each other and they listen to each other and it's respectful. And, we cultivate this whole connection between parent and child. And in the teen years, I have seen that adolescents start to extend that bubble, if you will, or apply that template of what connection looks like, healthy connection, healthy relationship, what that looks like. They start to apply it in more deep and intimate ways to their peers. And I think that sometimes that can be hard for parents who have been so focused on the parent-child connection to understand why the teen is now extending that outside of them into their peers.
Is your community a big fan of attachment theory
Yes.
and attachment parenting? Yeah,
Yes.
that's the feeling I was getting. Yeah, and at some point the kid is going to leave, right? And so the idea is that a secure emotional attachment has been developed, and so that even when the kid is thousands of miles away, then that connection will remain, and it will remain throughout your whole lives, hopefully.
Yeah, and this is why we nurture that connection so much, is so that we have built that template within their brain for how you treat each other and what it feels like to be supported and listened to and all of that. Like, really, that's the reason, well, a big part anyways, of why we're doing this in those earlier years, so that when they get to this point, they can start extending that to other people, to sort of grow beyond you. Like that really is a best case scenario. And yet I recognize that it is hard for a lot of people to make that transition, to accept that it's completely healthy and actually really advantageous for your kid to spend time with other people when you're not there, and for them to have these experiences that you're not a part of. I know that can be a difficult transition, and yet it's a really natural one and a really important one.
I think when some people criticize homeschooling or unschooling, they have this idea of an extremely tight-knit family where it's actually so tightly knit that it feels controlling, in the sense of the parents controlling dominating every aspect.
And sheltering.
And sheltering also. And so when this gets conflated with highly religious families too, there's a whole other discussion to have there. But even with non-religious families, this can be a perceived issue. And I feel like that's what we're brushing up against here. And in my final chapter of the book, I do focus on connection, and I talk a lot about this other book, Lost Connections by Johann Hari. And I think he does an excellent job of describing these different flavors of connection, which aren't just interpersonal connection, but also, for example, connection to the natural world, to meaningful values, to meaningful work. And it's a good proxy for what kids are often lacking in school and what they can find in like a supportive homeschooling community or a great alternative school. But I actually think we should go in a different direction, Rachel, because this discussion feels more applicable to the stuff I wrote about in the chapter about parenting. And again, as a non-parent myself, I recognize that I'm missing a certain foundational experience in my life, but I read a ton of the research on parenting for this book. And by far the most interesting thing that I read was this book, The Nurture Assumption by Judith Rich Harris. And this came out in the late 90s and was published again in 2007. And she was a psychology textbook author, and she was reviewing all of the literature on nature versus nurture, genes versus environment. And long story short, she said, well, the way that a kid turns out in the long run is in fact about half genes and half environment, which is the scientific consensus. But she said, we all assume that it's parental nurture that forms the bulk of the environmental influence. And she said, actually, it really seems more likely that it's the peer influence. And this book was quickly maligned in the popular media with the tagline, like, do parents matter? With, the assumed answer, no, they don't. Mm-hmm. And but I think this is a really wonderful book, and I think that it's worth the read. You need to have a certain taste for like long, like social science tracks, but Judith Rich Harris is a fascinating and really hilarious woman. She passed away recently. And she said over and over again in the book, I'm not saying that parents don't matter. She's saying that the one-on-one relationship that you build with your kid matters to a great deal. But she said it's not categorically different from the one-on-one relationship that you might have with your spouse or with a sibling or with a good friend. And she has a great line from the book, which is, I'll paraphrase, does it matter how I treat my spouse? Well, yes, it matters if we want to become lifelong friends and if I, care what he thinks about me and, if he's going to treat me well and I'm going to treat him well, then yes, of course it matters. But if I treat my spouse in a certain way, do I imagine that I'm going to somehow change the person who he is or really change the trajectory of his life? No, that would be assuming that you have far more influence and control than you actually do. And so parents really do matter. And I think this aligns with what you're saying about having a really strong attachment to your kid and a really secure foundation and a really loving relationship. But that is not the same thing as having a great deal of control of your kid's life. And Judith Rich Harris said, the control and the shaping, especially once a kid becomes an adolescent, is really coming more from their peers, because humans are groupish animals. And the first group that most of us identify is kids versus adults. And this kind of makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because you're going to be growing up and existing in the world with the kind of cohort of people who's close to your age. And the older generation is going to pass away. And so you are, to a large degree, you're going to align and look to your peers. And that happens in full force, starting when a kid becomes a teenager.
I want to jump in and state emphatically that I disagree with Blake's conclusion, which he gets from Judith Rich Harris, that peer orientation is more natural and more influential than parent orientation. You'll hear in a minute that I tell him that I disagree, but I don't go into detail, and upon listening back to the conversation, I want to explain why. First, the parent is the nature-intended magnetic pole of orientation for children of all warm-blooded species. We attach to our parents, and all future relationships exist in relation to that original connection. Second, from an evolutionary perspective, babies, kids, adults, and older members of society were not rigidly separated. Sure, a hunting party would go off for an afternoon to secure meat for the tribe, but everyone was living together in a multi-generational village of attachment. The isolated peer relationships that we're seeing more now are a very modern condition brought about largely by schools. Separated from their parents, children are unable to endure that attachment void, and so they orient to each other. Doctors Gordon Neufeld and Gabor Mate, in their book Hold On to Your Children, discuss this shift away from the parent-oriented attachment village and a lot of the problems we're seeing as a result of it. Full disclosure, I'm only about halfway through this book, and already there are a lot of details that I would disagree with, but they do speak to this parent versus peer orienting very well. In addition to that academic context, most of us can simply reflect on our personal experiences in childhood and recognize that the depth of trauma we could suffer at the hands of a friend pales in comparison to the depth of trauma we could suffer at the hands of a parent. A hug from mom could heal and comfort in a way that a hug from a friend never could, no matter how much we love that friend or how wonderful their hugs were. And baby ducks mature and leave the nest. For humans in particular, the peer connection is a powerful component to that transition, where we extend our sphere of attachments beyond our family of origin into relationships with people who will become mates and coworkers. So let them fly free and be the nest they can always come home to. Now let's get back to the conversation with Blake. I am familiar with her work, and I do disagree that the peer relationship is just as impactful as the sort of primary attachment figure relationship. However, I actually do really appreciate the point that I take away from her work, which is that so often and this is true of the educational approach too, like the mainstream educational approach, we sort of perceive children to be like the tabula rasa, like these empty vessels that we just like a software program that we just get to program it ourselves, and everything that we do directly determines like the outcome. You write the code and it creates the program, and those are the traits that are expressed, the things that you programmed in. And I completely agree with her evidence-based conclusion that is not, and she's not the only one to say that, but that is not how it works. And instead, I try to help parents focus on accepting who their child is and acknowledging that you don't create this human being. They are already a human being. And the things that you do as a parent, like the parenting as a verb, is not about eliciting a certain outcome. It's about it's for its own sake. It's about, like you said with the husband, like I treat my husband well because I enjoy having a loving, empathetic relationship with him. And we live in this life together, and not because I'm trying to change him or create him into being a certain way or a particular
mold him
person.
Or program him.
Right. And so I think that is, while I don't 100% agree with everything she says, I think that is an important point. And I totally got why you included it in the book, because I think it helps us sort of make that transition into the teen years, to sort of let go of your attachment to creating a human being, because you don't get to create them. They just are. And to instead allow them to just grow and reach out and connect with those more peer-based networks, and to just let them be the person that they're going to be. And then sort of you kind of take a supporting role, like a more of a backseat, like you're not in the driver's seat kind of role in helping them to make that sort of final leap out of the nest.
So can I ask you a question, Rachel?
Yes.
What do you think is the overlap, if any, between attachment parenting and over-identification with one's child, which is a very prevalent modern phenomenon? And I have no idea what the answer to this question is, by the way.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. It's definitely an issue that I've been aware of. The two are not necessarily combined. Like, I think that attachment parenting is just sort of centering an honoring of your kids' needs and the bond between a parent and child. You just sort of center things around that. But that is not the same thing as perceiving your child to be an extension of yourself. The two are often conflated, but are not the same thing. So I can respond sensitively and consistently to my child's communication of upset, while also not being overly invested, while not feeling the feeling that they are feeling and getting lost in that feeling myself at the same time, because I believe that they are an extension of me. I sometimes talk about a parent being like a lighthouse when their child is in the midst of a storm. And I can only take that position if I acknowledge the separateness of me and my child. So connected, yet separate.
I like it. When's your book coming out?
I have 4 books out.
The one about this concept specifically,
but this one I have not written on, and I totally am. I'm actually working on, because I have a Sage parenting book, but I'm working on completely rewriting it. And one of the things that I already have outlined and addressing in the connection section is this bit that you're talking about, that those two things are often conflated, and we need to work to kind of tease those apart a little bit.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, let's talk about college. And by the way, thank you for this conversation. This is fantastic. I love when we don't have all the answers and we can just organically debate things. This is fabulous. Okay,
Great.
College. So in the book, you describe college as our modern secular religion. Share what you mean by that.
It's the one thing we've all agreed upon as a universal good thing. No matter who you are, no matter your background, no matter your inclinations, you should go to college, some form of higher education, and more is essentially always better. And that is tantamount to a blind faith, I think. And it's, in an age when so many things are divided, just the fact that there's one thing we can still all agree upon is kind of amazing. And that makes, our faith in education, by which we mean schooling and training, very strong. And that makes it very difficult to walk away from the conventional educational path, which is the safer route. It's perceived to be the safer route towards higher education. And so I think it's very difficult to, for example, just write a book about, let's say, unschooling in the K through 12 realm without ever mentioning college, because there's so much anxiety wrapped up in the question of, if my kid wants to go to college, can they still go? Will they face insurmountable barriers? Will they be able to succeed in a structured academic environment if I haven't forced them to be in a similar environment for a significant amount of time? And so that's why college takes up a lot of space in my book, because it is our modern secular religion. And to some extent, the benefits of that so-called religion are real. But in many other cases, the benefits are not real, or they're actually negative.
Yeah. I think that I hope that people don't hold college on such high a pedestal. Or I like the religion metaphor for this reason, because religion feels unquestionable. And I really work hard to encourage people to question everything. And that doesn't necessarily mean that college is a bad idea or that you won't make more money if you go to college and get a really marketable degree, but that it isn't beyond question. So to sort of be comfortable, well, you're not going to be comfortable when you're questioning a pre-existing belief or assumption, but right. To be willing to question that, even though it feels so unquestionable and taboo to question.
But you have to question it, because there's some people think the worst thing that can happen to your kid is that they turn 18, they don't have the skills or background they need to apply to good colleges, or they can't get into any college at all. But I think while that might be an unpleasant situation, there are much worse situations, which might include your kid turns 18. They are just, forced by all of these cultural pressures to go straight into college. They take on a lot of student loan debt to make that happen. They get there. They think, why am I here? I don't know, but at least I have some freedom right now, so I'm going to take advantage of that. They party really hard, and maybe in their sophomore year, they drop out, and they have student loan debt, and they have no degree, and they don't have much direction or purpose either. Now that's a really hard situation right there, to be 20 years old and have, I don't know, $20,000 or $30,000 of debt that cannot be discharged in any event except for death on your name. And so that is the situation to avoid right there. And that's what I try to emphasize in the book. Do whatever you need to do to help your kid make a really informed and thoughtful decision about college. And the big thing that parents can do in that regard is to not say that it has to happen at age 18, to be extremely flexible with when college happens, the extent to which it happens, and recognize that, yes, there are still ways to get good jobs, even very good jobs, without a 4-year bachelor's degree today. And it's okay if a kid waits until they're 19 or 20 or 25 to decide to go to college. Let them dabble with community college courses. Community college is an incredible institution that we enjoy in the US and Canada and just a few other countries out there. In Europe, they don't have community college. It really is difficult to dabble with college. It's more of an all or nothing type proposition. And so take advantage of the flexibility we have in North America. Let your kid go at their own pace. And you just don't have to push college down their throats, because the only way they're going to get a lot out of it is if they have a certain amount of buy-in, and it's really their decision, not just yours, and not just this vague cultural peer pressure that says you got to go to college to be a complete human being.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. So is college on the table for unschoolers? What might the admission process or the transition into college look like?
Yeah, the majority of unschoolers that I've worked with do end up going to college to some extent. And I'd say, at least the majority get a 4-year degree. And the research, to the extent that we have research, shows that unschoolers and kids who go to really alternative schools where there's no curriculum, they graduate from college at the same rate that their peers in similar socioeconomic brackets do. And so it's not really going to help your kids' college prospects. It's not going to hurt their prospects either. In terms of how they get in, again, community college is a really big piece of the puzzle. A lot of the kids I've known around age 16 will start taking some part-time community college classes. Some will ramp up, do full-time, get their associates, and then they transfer in as a junior transfer, just like anyone else who has an associate's degree. Or they decide to apply as freshmen, and they put together a portfolio, a transcript. Maybe you need to say that your home school has issued a diploma, an unaccredited diploma to your kid. It's shocking how many places don't actually check if a diploma is accredited or not. And if they do need an accredited diploma, there's all these other mechanisms which aren't too hard to get something like that. And so they apply as freshmen with a portfolio. And yeah, this was probably a more tricky situation 20 years ago. But today, every college is familiar with homeschooled applicants. A lot of them have explicit instructions for what homeschoolers should do. That's how I compiled the section about how homeschoolers and other alternatively educated kids get into highly selective colleges like the Ivy Leagues. Like 9 out of 10 of the Ivy League colleges has explicit instructions for homeschoolers on their webpage. And so it's not rocket science. It does require a bit more time and elbow grease and some ingenuity, especially if your kid is trying to get into a highly competitive college. But that's the same, as if your kid is going to school also. It does require more effort and more ingenuity to get into a top school. So, if a kid really wants to go to college, you can nurture that interest. You can fan that flame. You can be their resource, be their coach, and help them jump through the hoops they need to jump through. But you don't have to, and you probably really shouldn't take on that college coaching role unless you are asked to.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I hope parents could sort of have some of their fears calmed a bit, just knowing that the little research that we do have shows that unschoolers do attend college at or above the rates that are comparable to their community. And that there is a path you can develop or find a path toward whatever your kid wants to work toward. Like you said, if Ivy League is what they want, then that can happen. So you're not limited in the sense that all of those doors are slammed shut to you. I am a huge advocate of community college. I went all the way through. I was in a doctorate program, and my favorite higher educational experience was community college. And my husband and I both have like the same 4-year degree. We graduated from the same school hanging on the wall. But I spent the first 2 years at the community college and had half as much debt as he did and did it in faster time. I graduated a semester earlier because the schedule is more flexible at community college. So I'm a huge proponent of community colleges. In my state, the state of Washington, I think I talked about this in one of the financial episodes because I'm a big fan of like debt freedom, that here in the state of Washington, we have a Running Start program where the government pays for between 16 and 18. They can attend community college basically. And then at the end of 2 years, they get a high school diploma and an associate degree, which is like a really nice opportunity. Though my kid knows that isn't mandatory, that's sort of the goal that she has set for herself. But even if she does it for a year and then decides it's not for her, that's a year of community college classes that are paid for. So why not try something like that? So you can kind of do a little bit of research and dip into your area. And I am confident that there are more opportunities around for your kid than you may have realized.
I agree.
All right. What are some experiences outside of college that teens can launch through? You talk about like apprenticeships and travel and wilderness camps and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So even though I'm a big fan of talking about video games and computer games and gameful-like activities, I've actually spent most of my career taking teenagers places where there's not screens or screens are very limited, and not because of some arbitrary rule, but because there's just more interesting things going on. So for the past 12 years, I've had this company, Unschool Adventures, and I've essentially used it to design really cool travel experiences and usually longer term travel experiences, like 6 weeks in a foreign country for a group of 10 to 12 teenagers, plus myself and one or two other trip leaders. And essentially wherever I feel like going, that's where the next Unschool Adventures trip has gone. It's been a fairly self-indulgent lifestyle business for me, but I'm not trying to be detrimental to what I've built here either, because I think if I'm really excited about a place that we're going, that, the teenagers can feed off of that. And it's not just me and my staff being like, okay, we're doing another trip to Argentina because this is the profitable, easy trip to run. It's like, no, we're doing it for our own personal reasons too. And they can pick up on that. So international travel is just a straightforward self-directed learning experience, especially when there's a language barrier. But even when there's not, when I've taken groups to New Zealand, it's easy to say, hey, I'm not going to do everything for you. That would be more like a package tour where we've scheduled every hour of the day. We'll be eating at this restaurant at 7 p.m. and then going to the evening showing of this film. And that's the kind of stuff that teens will quickly get bored with. They want some adventure and some intrigue.
Yeah. Your meals are prepaid. They need some risk.
No, just go out there, go explore Queenstown, New Zealand, and see what happens. Of course, we always have basic safety precautions and guidelines, and they carry a cell phone when they go out in small groups. And so it's not throwing caution into the wind here. It's just saying there's an acceptable threshold of risk. And let's kind of get to the far end of that threshold, because that's where teens really thrive. I think this is why programs like Outward Bound, when they take teens on 30-day backpacking wilderness trips, I think there's a reason that this is a really successful formula. Because when you're out there in the wilderness, if you decide that you want to do something, you want to kind of be a troublemaker, you want to stir things up, there are real boundaries out there. If you decide you're just not going to follow along and not going to do what the guides are telling you, and you're going to go off your own way, you will quickly find yourself, probably hungry and cold.
Yeah, natural consequences abound.
Exactly. And again, adolescents for so long have had a bunch of natural consequences. And often these have been unsavory natural consequences, ones that we don't want to continue to replicate. But we should try to create situations where there are these natural consequences, which are not actually going to traumatize a kid. Kind of like getting lost in a foreign city will most likely not traumatize a kid. Getting temporarily cold or hungry on a backpacking trip is a manageable experience. It's tolerable stress. And so find those sorts of environments. Find the ones that your kids will happily say yes to. This was a big reason why I became a champion of summer camps, because I see summer camps as this really accepted institution, at least in America, where kids can go off and they can be challenged and pushed often by these non-parental adults, and by getting into these peer groups where there is a belief that, like, okay, trying something new is the cool thing to do here. And the more that a kid can have a summer camp type experience, the more that the summer camp model can actually become the default model for how kids learn and grow, I think the better.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree with all that. It's funny too, because on the younger end of the parenting side, I'm often encouraging parents to allow their kids to feel out the natural consequences of their choices, and trying to explain to parents that that's how kids learn. If you invite your kid to wear a jacket and they don't want to bring a jacket, and then they're cold.
Yeah,
okay,
that's right.
So it's not your role to swoop in and be the problem solver and insulate them from natural consequences. It's sort of, this is going back to that attachment piece you were talking about. The attachment piece is that I'll be there with my kid while they're upset that they're cold and they don't have a jacket. Mm-hmm. So I'm not gonna get back in the car and drive home when we're in the middle of the forest and go get it. But as they're teenagers, this sort of just gets bigger. Like, they're able to tolerate safely greater risks, and they're wanting greater risks. And I kind of view my role as a parent in the same way. And I just allow my kid to gauge for herself how great of a risk she's comfortable taking. Like, my kid likes to plan trips to different states all on her own. And that's great. Like, what do you need from me? And I might point out, like, oh, I'm noticing that you don't have a ride from the airport to your friend's house or whatever. Like, here's a concern I'm spotting. What can you think of to like mitigate that? But really just sort of giving them the freedom to have these experiences. And that connection piece is that your kid knows that you're like the safe harbor to come home to when they're ready and need it. But they also get to really go out and have these amazing experiences. And that's how they grow. And that's how they figure out who they are and what their strengths are and what new things they need to learn and in what areas they could use some improvement. And, they're getting feedback from peers that don't love them the same way you do. And I mean that in a good way.
Yeah. And the same goes for non-parental adults.
Yes.
They're getting feedback and encouragement and coaching and sometimes being pushed outside of their comfort zones by these adults who, like you said, don't love them in the same way that their parents do. Ideally, these non-parental adults will always want to keep, the kids in their charge safe. They will always want to make sure that there's a basic feeling of security, that, that there's never a non-consensual kind of forcing into an uncomfortable situation that you can't escape. But, how do you toe that line? It can sometimes be easier for a non-parental adult, like a summer camp counselor, for example, to push a kid out of their comfort zones because they don't feel that same sense of unconditional love and attachment. And again, I don't want this to be turned into an argument for like sending kids to boot camps. But it's just pushing that threshold. The kid knows that they could always leave the summer camp and go back home to where their parents, unconditionally love them. But in the meanwhile, can I survive one more day here at this camp where these camp counselors are really like encouraging me to like get out of my social cocoon or to try this physical challenge that seems really intimidating, but is within my reach. That is a super important component. And so, doing stuff outside of the home, especially when kids are teenagers and interacting with a very wide community, a very multi-age community. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it really is the linchpin in helping a kid grow up as a full human being.
Yes. One of the things that you say, I'm going to read a quote in your book, is that you encourage parents to help teens, quote, seek the intersection between passions, what feels purposeful, skills, where your competency lies, and the market, or what people will actually pay for. That's where meaningful work is found. And I read that a couple times, it made me pause, and I really, really liked that. And I found a lot of value in that often when it comes to launching, sort of the focus is on work, and you might hear that follow your passion, sort of free spirit kind of thing. But there's also the reality of I think you gave an example in your book of would you be better off, what was it, being a painter, but having to work at a job you hate where people treat you like crap and you're not good at it to pay your bills? Or would you be better off being an accountant, which you enjoy and you're pretty good at and people pay well for it, but it's not may not be your ultimate passion in life that you want to spend 24 hours a day doing. So just to this kind of broader perspective than just the quip of follow your passion, or vice versa, like you said, the tiger mom thing, you're going to be a medical doctor. There's sort of this space in between that parents can look to. Yeah,
I think even better than medical doctor would be petroleum engineer, which is the highest compensated, popular major that's out there. So yeah, there is this middle space. And I think for the purposes of this podcast, it's much more interesting to talk about pushing back against the follow your passion orthodoxy, because it's not always the right path for a kid. And the way that I describe it in the book is that in that final chapter about connection, one thing that generates a sense of connection is feeling a sense of control over your environment. I mean, this is a psychology concept too. Everyone can agree that you want to feel a sense of control and you want to feel a sense of competency. And sometimes the thing that you can do really well, which will let you rise in an organization, for example, and have more control over your work life and your work day, sometimes that thing is not the thing that you passionately love to do in this sort of mysterious, almost spiritual way. And I think if you can merge, passions and skills and market, then really that is where meaningful work can be found. But there's another version of meaningful work, and that is work where you just you're really good at what you do and you're treated really well at your job. And that is its own form of meaning also. And, a lot of people do moonlight. They have their day job and then they do their passion projects at night. And that is a totally fine and respectable way to go through life. That being said, a lot of the unschoolers who I've worked with are less interested in that path, at least initially. They want to go for the gold. They want to go for the big enchilada, the passion skill market overlap. And if they can get it, great. If they can't, then they can always moonlight. They can always take the job that they know that they're good at, but it's not, particularly something they're passionate about. And the best book that's out there that elaborates on this view is the book by Cal Newport called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And it's a book that I really want to hate. And I wrote a very critical book review of it on my blog. But he does make some very valid points along the same line of reasoning.
I like that. I've recently in the last couple of years, really dived deep into the financial independence, the FIRE community. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated sort of this piece that they brought in for me, that you can also bring the time component into work. If you have a really low cost of living and you have a 50% savings rate or 70% savings rate, you can work at a job where you're very competent and the market pays a lot for it. And then you can spend, you basically retire and spend all the years after that just doing what feels purposeful. And not to say that everybody needs to mimic that exact formula, but I appreciated bringing in that time component to it, that any of these choices that you make or whatever balance feels right, whatever iteration fits the season of life that you're in, that's not necessarily forever. There's flexibility in that over time.
I agree. And we should keep all these different variables in mind. Meaning is an important variable. Also time, also money. And to just exclude any of these from your equation of figuring out what to do with your life and the time of your life is short-sighted.
Agreed. All right, let's move into our Q&A. I asked the Sage family community what questions they had about teens. And Siobhan asks, I've read it's developmentally normal for teenagers to rebel against their parents. And I've also read that it's not like that in every culture, which is right. And I know you are not an anthropologist, but I do know that you have worked with a lot of teens and have undoubtedly developed an opinion about that sort of mainstream fear of teenage rebellion. What say you?
What say I? I am skeptical of any teen who doesn't rebel, at least in some small way. There's something that gets under my skin when I think of a complete do-gooder, conformist type teen. And maybe this just reflects my own biases, which I'm not yet able to identify. But I think there's also something here, and the Judith Rich Harris literature, I think, brings that up for me about, kids and adults being members of different generations. And if we just mimicked our parents' generation, would values ever change? Would society ever evolve? Perhaps not. And so I feel like there's almost this duty to push back in some way against one's parents. But I won't explore that much further. I think there's also some truth in the idea that historically, and I'm talking about a long time ago, teenagers didn't really do this. And this makes me think of Peter Gray's research into forager cultures and how the parent-child relationship was there. Did he talk about that when he was on your podcast, Rachel?
I don't believe we covered that.
Oh, okay. Well, in his book, Free to Learn, and his blog on Psychology Today, he writes a lot about this. And this is something I take up in my book also, because he describes how forager or hunter-gatherer parents would not coerce their kids into doing much. They would let their kids play freely, and they would just learn everything they needed to become functional adults in their society. And I think that the research is correct. Where I take a bit of issue with this argument is when we try to map it directly onto the experience of modern day kids. And I could talk about that in many different ways, but for the purpose of this Q&A, I think that what's different about hunter-gatherer cultures versus today is that the concept of adolescence or being a teenager didn't really exist back then. This is a very modern invention, this period of extended adolescence. And essentially, a kid would go through a rite of passage in a forager community, and then they were an adult. Like, boom, transition's over. You're 14, get to work, make some babies, go on a dangerous hunt, you know?
Yes.
And so there wasn't really that much space given for young people to rebel or to push back, because this whole thing we call being a teenager just didn't really exist. And again, that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge as a non-anthropologist. That's my understanding of why that may have been true in the past.
No, I appreciate you pitching into that answer. I think initially when you were talking about how it's sort of inevitable or healthy in what you've seen for kids to push back and on the way their parents have seen things or done things, I would call that just differentiation more than I would call that rebellion. I think rebellion for me has an adversarial component. Rebellion requires oppression. And in order for there to be a rebellion, for there to be a fight, like there has to be an enemy, you know, there have to sort of be two sides. But if a teen is differentiating and developing their own opposing possibly views or making different choices than the choices you make, but you allow the space for that and honor that and support them in that, then I think what it looks like is not rebellion. In sort of that like mainstream commercialized, like you see every teenager in every movie.
I hate you,
sense.
Mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's some really helpful nuance, and I'd like to update my response.
Yes,
which is,
please.
The unschoolers who I've worked with and other self-directed learners, I guess I have witnessed a pretty minimal amount of outright rebellion, which is different from differentiation. And that seems to be, a credit to their parents and the parent-child relationship. And it's about not having this arbitrary control over the kid. I think ultimately that's what it is. If the parent makes a rule, the parent has an explainable reason for that rule. The parent is not acting like a homework cop enforcing the dictates of school that have been brought back home. And so you can have a much more straightforward, loving relationship. That's the model I have in my brain. And yeah, that makes sense that would lead to much less overt rebellion.
Yeah, if you have been utilizing control-based parenting, then it will fail in the teen years. Whereas, like, if you're parenting through collaboration and honoring your teen's growth into this season of greater independence and agency and autonomy and responsibility, then there's not much to rebel against. Like I said, there's not that opposing side sort of pushing you back down, which I do see in the mainstream parenting paradigm, where if all of the parenting has been based on control and then the teen starts pushing back and the parent pushes down harder, like, no, you do what I say. I said you be home, then that it sort of creates this modern phenomenon that we have of teenage rebellion. But I mean, if my teen says she wants to plan a trip to another state to visit a friend and I say, okay, great. Like, how can I help? Then there's not, there's that control piece, but then there's also an identity piece, which is something which is that thing that we sort of talked about earlier about that separation, where if you see your child as an extension of yourself, then you will struggle to tolerate and allow your child to differentiate and to grow more fully into their own person who might be quite different from you. So if you respect your child as a soul deeply connected to you, yet separate from you, then they don't have to buck against an identity that no longer fits. So just that you don't determine who your child becomes. They will show you who you are, and you just love them along the way.
A nice way to tie it all together, Rachel.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my teen, like when we'll watch a movie or something where there's like a teenager rebelling, she likes to joke, like, so I'm going to get older and I'm going to like throw plastic into the ocean because you guys are always talking about saving the turtles. I mean, she's like joking, but she's making the point that like she doesn't really have anything to rebel against. So she has to make up silly things.
You've starved me of this.
Yes!
This foundational cultural experience, mother and father. How dare you?
That's exactly it. Yes, you've starved me of my ability to rebel because I don't have anything to rebel about.
That's a victory right there.
Yes. So the show notes can be found at rachelrainbolt.com/podcast48, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So Blake, what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic? And first and foremost, we will be linking to your new book, which I loved and recommend everybody reads.
Oh, thank you. For teenagers specifically, my all-time favorite book is The Teenage Liberation Handbook by Grace Llewellyn. That was one of the books I read in college and really opened my eyes. I didn't know about unschoolers until I read that book. And I have the honor and privilege of being Grace's editor for the third and final edition of the Teenage Liberation Handbook.
Exciting!
Which will be coming out in 2021. And another place that I like to send most people is the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, Peter Gray's nonprofit that he co-founded. And I think for people, no matter what age or stage your kid is, there's something great to be found there. And finally, it's hard to make a universal recommendation for summer camps, but I just like to put a pitch out there for summer camps in general. I know it's a strange time right now in mid-2020 to be pitching summer camps because a lot of them are not happening.
Do it.
Yeah, but if you've ever, thought, would my kid be into summer camp or not? Give it a shot. There are so many different camps out there. And even, a lot of them are really pricey, but even your kid going to just 2 weeks of one overnight summer camp once might be a really kind of world-shattering experience for them. And so I just had my life so positively shaped by a few different summer camps. I try to encourage everyone to give it a good consideration themselves.
My kids have never done summer camp, and my teen was so excited to attend the Not Back to School camp. She had she was so excited about it that she'd figured out the transportation and the rides places, and then of course it was canceled because of this stupid pandemic. So as long as the camp is open next year, she is very much looking forward to going.
Great. And yeah, Not Back to School camp, I've worked there for over 12 seasons, and so I have a lot invested in that camp. It is objectively the best camp to go to if you're a self-directed teenager. I'll put that out there. And also, it's run by Grace Llewellyn. So really, my recommendation is Grace Llewellyn.
Oh, I love it. And selfishly, I want to go to the camp and hang out with you guys and get to know you better and enjoy the experience. But I'm afraid if I do that, that wouldn't quite give my kid the experience that I'm going for. So maybe
it might ruin it, yeah.
Can we get a parenting Not Back to School camp, or just a cool adult Not Back to School camp?
I'll put it in the hopper, Rachel.
Okay, put it in the comment box. All right, well, thank you so much for coming on, Blake. You really challenged me and threw us completely off script in the absolute best kind of way. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Well, I did too. Thanks so much for having me.